Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this conversation. This conversation is inspired by Adbusters' latest book, Manifesto for World Revolution. The purpose of this panel is to bring together diverse perspectives and expertise to highlight the interconnectedness of these issues and to discuss actionable steps towards systemic change. Our goal is to move beyond understanding these challenges to actively engaging and dismantling existing oppressive economic and environmental paradigms. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge our event host, Move to Amend, and a Radical Guide. Representing Move to Amend and the co-host for this event is Greg Cruledge. And Move to Amend is a coalition of 100 of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals who are committed to social, environmental, and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that is generally accountable to the people and not corporate interest. And I am Jason Bayless, representing a Radical Guide. A Radical Guide is a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering a global network of informed, engaged activists and radicals. Our mission is to amplify voices for liberation by connecting people with history and the future of anarchist, anti-authoritarian, and radical movements. This event is also supported by PM Press, Adbusters, and Cool World. PM Press is an independent radical publisher committed to challenging the status quo through thought-provoking literature. Adbusters is the producer of this book that we'll be referencing today, the Manifesto for World Revolution, and they have been on the forefront of exposing the impacts of corporate-driven consumer culture. Cool World is dedicated to improving the engagement and experience of politically progressive filmmakers, producers, nonprofit organizations, and their audience. And a deep, deep gratitude and thanks to Alfonso for running the tech behind the scenes and supporting all of us during this panel tonight. And together, with the support of these organizations, we aim to inspire action and foster a collaborative approach to tackling some of the most oppressing issues of our time. So thank you to these groups for supporting this conversation, and thank you for joining us tonight. There'll be a Q&A at the end of this conversation, at the end of the panel discussion, so that you can also play a role in this. So write down your questions. There'll be a time that you can put them in the chat, and then we'll answer your questions with us and the panelists. So again, thank you so much for being here. And Greg, I'll pass it on to you.
Well, thanks, Jason, and welcome everyone. Appreciate your participation. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce the panelists. William Robinson is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His scholarly research focuses on macro and comparative sociology, globalization and transnationalism, political economy, political sociology, development and social change, immigration, Latin America, and the Third World, and Latino studies. Try to repeat all of that. Gord Hill is an Indigenous writer, artist, and activist. He is the author and illustrator of the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book, and the Antifa comic book. All three, by the way, published by Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver. He also is the author of the book, 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance, which is published by AK Press, located in Oakland. Jenny Spanos is a co-director of Move to Amend. As a journalist, she observed the immense stranglehold corporate power exerts over government and communities. This experience shaped her perspective and fostered a deep passion and focus in her organizing work on environmental, social, and economic justice issues, leading her to collaborate with various intersectional grassroots movements, building for a just and sustainable future. And we're really glad to have her Move to Amend. Daniel Lee, former Culver City mayor, became the first African-American member of the Culver City Council in its over 100-year history. He passed rent control, created permanent supported housing, began a reparations project, and opposed an oil field. He has a doctorate in social work from USC. Daniel currently works as a project director at the James Lawson Institute. He also currently serves on the board of directors of Democracy Unlimited, Move to Amend, and other organizations. Finally, Kat Dodds is CEO and founding partner of Cool World Platform, developed to help organize around climate, democracy, and economic and racial justice. Formerly with Adbusters turned impact producer in 1999, she oversaw marketing for The Corporation, winner of 26 international awards, a great flick. She currently manages worldwide distribution rights for The Corporation and Manufacturing Consent, and the non-theatrical rights for The New Corporation, which we connected with her a number of years ago to co-sponsor. So there you have it.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here and be willing to share your insights. Today's discussion will revolve around some of the key issues, as we mentioned before, highlighted in Adbusters' latest book, Manifesto for World Revolution. And to kick things off, we want to dive into a conversation around the current state of the capitalist system and where we'll explore the true cost of production. And before we get into questions, I just want to kind of define what the true cost of production means so we can all participate in this conversation. So when we talk about the true cost of production, we're referring to the hidden social, environmental, and economic cost, often not reflected in the price of goods and services. So these includes labor exploitation, environmental degradation, and societal impacts of the production process. So with that, let's begin with you, William. With your scholarly research spans a wide array of critical issues, including globalization, political economy, and social change. Given your extensive work, can you please start us off by giving us an overview of how you see the current system, the current state of the capitalist system, and how the true cost of production factors into this analysis? And welcome.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this event. It's an honor to be here with such a distinguished co-panelists. And I want to say that I read the manifesto with great interest. I think it is timely and it is urgent. So global capitalism is in an all-out crisis. It's what I refer to as an epical crisis. It's multidimensional. It's an economic or a structural crisis of chronic stagnation, of what technically we call overaccumulation. And this chronic stagnation is pushing the system towards a new round of violent expansion. Of course, we don't have to go further than Gaza, but we can look at the Congo or wherever we go in the world. It's violently expanding outward at this time in the face of that stagnation. But it's also a political crisis of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. There was a global poll carried out in 2020, and it showed that 56% of the world's population considers that capitalism now has expended itself. It should be overthrown. It's not doing any good to humanity. So the fact that the system is in a political crisis is good for those of us that want to overthrow it, move on to a new system. But what it does mean is that states everywhere are intensifying state violence. There's more authoritarianism. There's a turn towards dictatorship. There's a rapid mobilization of fascist forces. But it's also a social crisis, technically what we call a crisis of social reproduction. Everyone's familiar with this data on inequality. 1% of humanity controls 52% of the world's wealth. 20% of humanity controls 95% of the world's wealth. So 80% of humanity has just 5% of the world's wealth. Literally, billions of people cannot survive from day to day in this global capitalist system, this social disintegration wherever we go. Whole countries, whole regions are collapsing. We go no further again than the Congo, than Haiti, than Sudan, and whole pockets in the United States here. But it's also, finally, because there's these big four dimensions of the crisis, an ecological crisis. The biosphere is reaching the limits. It's going to collapse if we continue the way we've been going. Even the transnational elite has been forced to recognize that this is a poly-crisis at every level. So global capitalism can't survive into the 22nd century. The big question we need to ask ourselves is, will global capitalism take us down before we can overthrow it and move on to a new system based on social need and not private profit? So with that context as the crisis, the true cost of production, this is really very important part of the manifesto. It's really brilliant, it's really urgent. And of course, if implemented as a principle, as a law, the true cost of production, that would radically change things all around the world. But here is really the point I want and it would, I would say, undermine transnational corporate power. But here's the thing about the true cost of production: as much as I would love to see that actually take place, it goes against the very logic of capitalism. Capitalism can't reproduce itself if everything is represented by its true cost. This is not a basis that capitalism can even exist in. So in order to implement this project, this principle, this law of the true cost, that requires a change in power and the overthrow of the capitalist system, of capitalist power. Right? Because under capitalism, it's not possible. So ultimately, the true cost principle boils down really to an issue of power and the changing the whole social order.
Thank you, William. Anybody want to respond to that, extend to that? Go ahead, Daniel.
So, yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that I would add is that it's a crisis, a moral crisis, and an empathy crisis. I think when, what was it, Paul Rand was a senator, he used to carry around Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness as sort of his guide, and that sort of worked its way into our policies. That's the reason the word and the opposition to the word woke exists, because they want people to think that it's anathema to human existence to care about other people, and that's a horrible thing. One of the books I push on people a lot is called The Spirit Level, and it sounds new agey, but it's really a compendium of scientific studies that show when we all do better, we all do better. I think where a lot of us are missing it, whether you're talking about the actual left, which is mostly outside of the Democratic Party, or the Progressive Democratic Party, or, you know, some really sort of enlightened centrists who don't think people should be on the street or be criminalized for being on the street, is that having the right answers isn't enough. We need to actively organize, and we need to call out and recognize our enemies. We need to call out the moral failings of not just the Republican Party, but of the Democratic Party. And we need to call out the ways in which both parties have endorsed totalitarianism and fascism. We need to show that these student protests that have been happening around the country have been violently oppressed for no reason. This is their campus. This is where they live. We need to be more confrontational with our elected leaders. And the fear of the boogeyman Trump, who was indicted, who was found guilty once again today, has left us sort of impotent. We're like, well, we don't want Trump, so I can't say anything. And the more silent we are, the less critical we are, the more fast, complete and total fascism will take over not just our country, but countries around the world. We need to be more combative, and we need to be more comfortable doing that, because the true cost, and something that I'm starting to write about a little, often filters down to working class people. There's a thing that a lot of people have been writing about called time poverty. And time poverty really sort of incorporates the amount of time that working class people spend going to work, wage theft, all of these other things that people who have, you know, more well-paying jobs like some of us don't have to deal with, to the point where, you know, families barely see their children before they go back to work. And, you know, the holidays are the only time where they get a chance to be human in this capitalist and fascist system. So we need to talk about that more, and we need to be critical of the people who agree with us on 50%, 70% of stuff, if we're really going to talk about the true cost of everything, because the true cost is our lives, and the true cost is a sustainable world.
Thank you. Gord, I would like to bring you in and see your insight and knowledge around what the current state is with the capitalist system through your lens.
And you're muted.
Dave Freeze.
He's muted.
For indigenous peoples. You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Am I talking?
Yeah, we got you now. There was just a lag.
Oh, okay. Yeah, for indigenous peoples, I mean, it's not just the current cost of production and all, but it's like a historical thing that goes back really to the early stages of colonization and the expropriation of indigenous lands. And in Canada, and I think in the United States to a great extent, was the taking of generations of children and placing them into our residential schools for the purpose of assimilating them into the European ways of life. So this has generational impacts on Indigenous peoples, because a lot of the children suffered physical and sexual abuse in these institutions, and they were also acculturated. So they were forbidden from practicing their culture, their language, and this has a major impact on our communities today. So we have intergenerational trauma that arises from these residential schools, including sexual abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, and just the general loss of culture and the sense of like a loss of identity for a lot of Indigenous peoples. And not only that, but in the 1960s, we have in Canada, it's called the 60s scoop, where tens of thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families and fostered out into non-Indigenous, non-Native homes. So, I mean, that's one of the true costs of like capitalist production and its impact on Indigenous peoples. The expropriations of our lands has left us with very small land bases that we now know as reserves. And these reservation lands in Canada, they were established through the 1876 Indian Act, which was an apartheid set of laws, separate set of laws just for Indigenous peoples. And it covered almost every aspect of our daily lives. So the reservation system was imposed through the Indian Act. A status, if you're a Native, if you're to be considered a Native or not, is through the Indian Act. And the band council system, which is a local form of governance on the reservations, was also imposed through the Indian Act. So it's a part of the history of colonization, but these conditions still exist today, so they have a big impact on Indigenous peoples. Then with the expropriation of our traditional territories, our homelands, our traditional lands, and confining Indigenous peoples to these reservations, it opened up all the rest of the territory to resource exploitation. So in British Columbia, on the West Coast here where I am, a major part of that has been logging. So all our old growth forest has pretty much been logged out. And our culture was really dependent on the red cedar tree. We called it the tree of life, because everything we had, pretty much all our material culture, came from the cedar tree, the red cedar. So our houses, our shelters, our clothing came from the cedar bark. Our forms of transportation, which are our canoes, came from cedar. All our dance regalia that we use in our winter ceremonies, which and these ceremonies, the potlatch, these ceremonies, they maintain our history as families and communities, and they assert families' rights to resources in these territories. So this red cedar is a critical part of our culture, but now the cedar forests have been pretty much logged out, and with climate change, it's a struggle for the red cedar to survive, because it's a product of a temperate rainforest, which is where we live. And right now, the region we're in is it's in the highest drought stage. You know how the government has different levels of drought. So here on the West Coast, we're in the highest level of drought, and we're a temperate rainforest. Like, this should not be happening, but this affects our culture, because the cedar trees are really it's hard to find old growth cedar, which our culture really relies on. And then also it's impacting all of our traditional foods, including wild salmon. So we've had a drastic decline in salmon stocks, both from industrial fishing, overfishing of the oceans, and from climate change, the warming waters, and it makes it more difficult for some of these salmon runs to survive. So all of this, this depletion of our traditional resources, it forces indigenous peoples even more into the capitalist way of life and into the wage economy. And then, of course, we have like really high unemployment, especially for a lot of our reserves are in these more rural locations. So we have very high unemployment. And then, of course, the cost of living, everything's becoming much more expensive. Transportation is becoming much more expensive. So all these crises that William talked about, I mean, these are impacting indigenous peoples in a pretty profound way now. And I think it's impacting everybody. But for a lot of our communities, we're living in pretty rural areas. So everything has to be like, the transportation costs have to be factored into the movement of these goods and, to our communities to sustain ourselves. So I really promote the idea of survival, resistance and survival, because through resistance, we can protect what's left of our territories, the resources that are in our territories, but also kind of like a survival mindset. We need to be looking at ways that we can become more self-sufficient. For example, through the establishment of community gardens, I think is going to become much more important, both because of the rising price of food items, but also because I mean, how much longer is this system going to be able to sustain itself? I mean, we've already seen major impacts to infrastructure, like through the COVID epidemic. I mean, it was a pretty minor pandemic, I think, but it had a major impact on infrastructure around the world. And then here we've been impacted with the climate change. We had a massive flooding a few years ago that wiped out railways and highways and had a big impact, especially in our rural communities, because that's what we depend on for the movement of goods, right? So, yeah, just some thoughts. But for me, those are some of the real costs of production and how they've impacted indigenous peoples. So they've depleted our resources, they've stolen our resources, they've degraded our resources now through climate change and made us increasingly dependent on this capitalist system at a time when the capitalist system is in this major crisis. And I think everybody can kind of see that it's in decline, and it's just a matter of how long can it sustain itself. And that's, I think, something that our communities really need to look at.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that you're bringing in. Normally, when we talk about true cost of production, there's a narrative in the space that we need to do something so we can show the true cost of production. And with what you're reflecting on and what you're showing at, what you're pointing at is saying, no, the true cost of production is being forced upon us because Mother Nature's we're having massive climate change. We're seeing all these things happening. We're seeing the direct impacts on communities because of this cost of production. So I really appreciate you bringing that in. I appreciate Daniel and William also bringing in your key points. And I want to bring in Greg to the space. See if you have any questions that you want to add to this.
No, I just wanted to shift, I think, to this other arena of work and consideration. We want to consider now the role of legal frameworks in creating fundamental system change that promotes justice, authentic self-determination, and a livable world. The current macro legal framework, that being the U.S. Constitution, and profoundly anti-democratic interpretations of its amendments are increasingly seen as major obstacles to these ends, including reining in ever-increasing corporate dominance of literally every aspect of our society, an element of capitalism to be sure, as well as blocking the ability of grassroots movements to achieve systemic solutions to systemic problems. And the manifesto, for those of you who may have taken a look at it, devotes an entire section to what's called corporate crackdown. So I want to bring in Jenny and ask you, what challenges and obstacles, constitutional and otherwise, does Move to Amend face in this struggle against corporate rule, and how can they be overcome?
Well, thank you. I want to thank everybody too for inviting me into this space. and for joining us in this space. I think it's really important to have these conversations. And I agree with William that this is very timely in this book. So we do know that corporations, bankers, warmongers, and corporate media maintain this system. So these are pretty high on some obstacles that must be overcome. Of course, the corporate hijacking of the U.S. Constitution is certainly an obstacle in this struggle to end corporate rule. The hijacking of corporate constitutional rights is really the foundation in which corporations have built their power and are able to rule, right? It's been legalized. One of the first and one of the most egregious was the hijacking of the 14th Amendment and Equal Protection Clause granted to corporations when they, of course, were meant only for human beings. And this amendment, the 14th Amendment, was specifically written to include former slaves. And, there's a saying, it moved to amend. Well, I'll get to that later. But I think these are really big obstacles that we are working to overcome. There's plenty of other insane Supreme Court decisions that granted corporation constitutional rights since then. The First Amendment right to free speech, Fifth Amendment right takings clause. These developed in us, an inability to get anything passed, like our environment, for example. The oil companies have been cooking our planet, have known about it for over 50 years, but they have a right to remain silent. They have a right to spend unlimited sums of money in our elections. These are some of these challenges. Move to Amend is actually a rise to that challenge. In a living room a little over 10 years ago, they saw the writing on the wall. Some organizers, national organizers, they came together. They decided, hey, let's counter this. Instead of always on defensive, this is an offensive stand to pass an amendment that makes clear that corporations are not people and that money is not free speech. So we do have one of the tools that we are using to agitate, activate, and educate with is the We the People Amendment. It's currently introduced in the House as HJR 54 and has 84 co-sponsors. But we know, of course, this isn't going to change the world. Another way that we alone, but it is a way to engage and activate and work together and collaborate together. Sounds like frogs are waking up. We abut to wetlands here, and it's my favorite sound. Also in the book, which I found really exciting, was that they talk about charter revocation and 3 strike statutes where, corporations that participate in scandalous behavior will be held accountable for their actions. And in fact, there's an active campaign in Ohio right now that's pushing the Attorney General there, Dave Yost, to pull the plug on an Akron-based energy company, First Energy. Members of this coalition, which includes Move to Amend, is to force a law that's already on the books, right? Corporations haven't always had this power. They have hijacked these rights and this power and built their foundation on that. So the coalition is wanting to revoke First Energy's charter because they have admitted to the largest bribery scandal in the state's history. They admitted to paying $60 million in bribes to a former House Speaker, Larry Householder, and others, including Sam Randazzo, who was the former chairman of the Public Utilities Commission in Ohio. And just like we saw in California, they got a slap on the wrist. They secured $1 billion tax-funded bailout. And then they only had to pay a $230 million fine. So these are ways, though, to blunt corporate power, and it's direct, and it really highlights that there are solutions that we can use to take our power back and to create that bioeconomics, if you will. As the book says, put bio in front of everything, because that's how we need to think about things. And I think that's really powerful and important. And of course, funding, because that's always a challenge, right? And MTA, we don't accept any corporate funding, any government funding. It's all grassroots supported. So these are some of the challenges, but again, we have the best supporters in the world, I think. So I think that helps us keep this work going.
Thanks, Jenny. Just wanted to offer any of the other panelists an opportunity to weigh in on this whole arena of the obstacles that corporate entities pose to trying to create anything approaching a, representative democracy, either directly or indirectly. Well, Daniel, I'll just call on you. As a former mayor, and what was not mentioned in the intro is you ran for Congress recently. How have corporate constitutional protections of property, which include corporations, of course, protections of property over protections of people and communities, which is what our Constitution does, how has that reality inhibited your ability as a former mayor and congressional candidate, and those you worked with in coalition to try to achieve anything approaching justice, peace, democracy, sustainable world, anything along those lines?
Sure. I wanted to start by saying something else real quick, though. I think a lot of times we look at the Constitution as this cold, dead document when it's actually very flexible. And the judges that we appoint, not just at the Supreme Court level, but, on the Ninth Circuit and the Fifth Circuit and all of these other levels, actually have a profound effect on how the Constitution is interpreted. And a lot of more Republican administrations have really felt that they can really create reality by interpreting the Constitution in whatever way they see fit. Cheney really focused on executive privilege. I still talk about it as the Cheney administration. And then, of course, a lot of Trump's motivation was around not going to prison, or if he gets sent to prison, having some judges that can get him out. Similarly, we see in the Democratic Party this sort of reinforcement of the power of corporations, because since and before Citizens United, both major political parties have benefited from corporations and have gotten the majority of their fundraising from them. I had a lot of good success in Culver City as mayor. We passed rent control in a city that was incredibly anti-rent control. We started a reparations process. One of the only cities in the country, one of the only cities in California. We actually voted to close down the Inglewood oil field, the portion that's in Culver City, the largest urban oil field in the United States. And Los Angeles City and Los Angeles County used our logic. We had other successes, but in my run for Congress, a couple of interesting things happened. Some other candidates collaborated, and one candidate joined the race just to push me out, so I would come in third. She raised $450,000 more than me, but only beat me by 583 votes, which is, pretty good. It was 0.6%. But the bigger thing, and the thing that, not a lot of the people who supported me thought was significant at the time, is that for the first time in that election, and they targeted Summer Lee and I think 18 other people running in Democratic primaries at the time. Summer Lee was the only person that ran, but Sam Blankman-Fried's PAC spent $600,000 against me. The Democratic Majority for Israel spent $200,000 against me, and AIPAC spent $400,000 against me in the primary. And it was the first time that any of these groups had played in a Democratic primary. And I think that really speaks to the power of corporations to influence the expression of democracy. I feel like the Constitution is the written word, but you got to say it out loud, in order for it to operate. And the expression of democracy is being encumbered by corporate power at every level. I'm talking about my experience on the congressional level, but the person that I endorsed to replace me on the Culver City Council was the victim of about $600,000, and I'll end here because I hear your timer. $600,000 from one of our local billionaires in races where candidates usually raise and spend $30,000. I think I raised $28,000, $100,000 max. One billionaire spent $600,000 to $700,000 and bought a seat because he didn't like our bike lanes. He didn't like all of the active transportation that we put into our city. So the influence is very palpable, but it's not just at the federal level. We all know about Alec on the state level, literally writing policy for people. But there are billionaires buying local seats on a regular basis. In the last 20 years, we've talked about, local organizing and local politics is the way that we can make change. But the more corporate power becomes entrenched, the less that is true.
Yeah.
Indeed. And the
Indeed.
legal framework that we're dealing with constitutionally is it sort of establishes the contours within which we can function. And it seems like every year or so, that contours, that box on every side just gets narrower and smaller, making it more difficult to try to reflect and express ourselves. Anyone else on the panel very quickly want to add to this discussion? Yeah, William, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go quickly, and thank you so much, Jenny and Danielle, for your comments. I want to respond really quickly with 2 points. One is that, one of the problems in confronting corporate power is that capital went global from the 1980s and on as an intentional strategy to get around the power that we could organize in our communities, the poor communities, the working class, the popular classes. It was a deliberate strategy to get out of the nation state. And that gives transnational corporations this incredible structural power over the power of states, of governments, local governments, federal governments, and over our community. So we're up against that. But I want to make a second quick comment directly in response to something that Daniel pointed out. Daniel, AIPAC spent several $100,000 to get rid of you, and that's just out of, one little municipality within Los Angeles. So I want to link this to what's going on in our campuses. There is really this global intifada of solidarity with Palestine and against the genocide right now. And that involves these encampments on all of our campuses, including my own campus. The encampment is still there. Our students are being violently repressed. And they're being repressed not just by the Israel lobby and the police, but by the transnational corporations that are benefiting from their investments in Israel and from this genocide. So what we've seen is the corporate colonization of our universities. Our universities, including my own, the University of California, it's been converted into a brain trust that does the research for the corporations. My university receives multi-million-dollar donations every year from the military industrial corporations, from the pharmaceutical corporations. And so when our students protest the genocide in Palestine, they're directly confronting corporate power, and that's why they are violently repressed.
Yep. All right, very good. I think we have sort of wrapped up this section. Turn it back over to you, Jason.
I think
Thank
this
you,
is
everyone,
a good,
for speaking.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a good segue. I think we're getting into the next topic automatically. We're going to focus our shift, start looking at the grassroots level. I think William brought that in nicely, talking about what's happening, on the campuses. So I want to keep that topic open. So if anybody wants to respond or add to that, feel free to do so now. Because we're looking at, we look at the systemic structures and what can we do at the policy level and at the government level. But now let's look at where's our power? If corporations has intentionally seized this power and starts, having influence on us, where's the people's influence in this? Where do we have leverage in this? And I want to bring Gord into this and because of your experience and expertise in terms of highlighting what's happening and indigenous resistance, what what are you seeing? What strategies are you seeing happen in indigenous communities that we could be applying on a larger scale, or that it's just good to know, to be aware of? So as we're building up the grassroots level of challenging corporate power and kind of changing the way the system functions.
Well, I think for indigenous peoples, like our movements are really are mostly based around families and communities, and so we've had an intergenerational movement that's existed where children of people who were active previously continue on in this resistance. So we've been able to maintain a history of resistance and kind of like a lineage of resistance. So the children that were active, or the people that were active in the 1960s and the 1970s with the Red Power movement and the American Indian movement, their children went on to become active in grassroots movements in the 1990s and the 2000s with groups like the Native Youth Movement and other kind of manifestations of this. So it's a generational thing. So I think that's really important for movements to have that, because it gives more depth to the movement. And these movements include children and elders. So it's not just a youth-focused youth liberation, because that's not really what it is. We're talking about the liberation of people. It has to include all the people, and our elders are a really important part of our culture because of the knowledge and the experience they have to offer. And if I look at different movements in Europe, militant radical movements, there's a much more, I think, a broader age range that's involved in these movements, especially in countries like Italy. There's people that have been involved in these resistance movements since the late 60s, into the early 1970s, that are still somewhat participating and active in these movements. So I think that's something that's really important. Culture is a really important part of indigenous movements, and our traditional culture, and then that traditional culture being adopted to meet the needs of the present generations, and how it's reinterpreted to meet the needs of the present generations. So I think that's a really important part of it as well. Our culture really, I think, promotes the collective, the communal efforts. So people talk about the people. When I was first associating with people from the American Indian movement, who are kind of like a generation before me, I mean, they often talked about the people, and you can see it reflected. It's a part of the traditional culture, talking about the people, and that's something that people might just associate. That's something like the radical left might talk about, or communist movements might use that type of terminology, but it's actually a part of our traditional culture to be considering the people. How can we mobilize the people? How does this affect the people? Those types of considerations. How does it going to affect the future generations? What impact will our decisions have today? How is that going to impact the future generations? So I think these are like important parts of movements. The history of resistance is really important, because that's how you maintain a culture of resistance. And for us, a warrior culture is a really important part of our culture, and our maintaining that history of resistance and a culture of resistance as well. So I think, those are some things I think that are a part of our indigenous movement, but I think is important for any movement to have. You need to mobilize people, the community, family. I think other movements, they're more fragmented, and they don't really have a family basis involved as such. Where families are actually maybe so dysfunctional or so divided. So you have these individuals stepping out, and now they become involved in social movements, and these social movements are comprised of all these individuals coming together. But for us, I've seen so many of our grassroots campaigns and struggles that are really based around these family units, and they're like the foundation of a lot of these movements. So I think that's a really important part of our movement, our struggles, is that family connection, those family relations, being out on the land. Like, I know a lot of people are really urban focused. because there's a lot of power in the urban environment because of the sheer numbers of people. That's where the corporations are concentrated, their headquarters. There's a lot of critical infrastructure in the urban centers, technology, but in the rural areas, this is where you also have a lot of critical infrastructure, transportation, communications, all this other stuff is located in rural areas. And so I think that's an important part to consider as well. You've seen other struggles around the world. The movements really kind of came out of the rural environments and they kind of laid siege to the cities almost. If you look at some of the indigenous struggles in Ecuador and Bolivia in years past, those massive mobilizations, they really hit the infrastructure in the highways and the railways. And they were basically laid siege to the cities and were able to almost shut them off from the movement of capital. But those are some things that I think are good to consider.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you. I want to lift up what you're bringing about cultural narratives and bring in Kat to this because I'm curious what you see the role of cultural narratives and media platforms in supporting grassroots movements, and bringing about cultural change from the bottom up.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing me into this conversation. And I've just been reflecting on some of the things that were said already that tie into all of these things. Like I think what you said at the very beginning, Gord, about resistance and survival is really important, because I think what's going on in terms of narratives is that resistance has been framed across the world, especially in the context of what's going on in Gaza. But it didn't start with that. It started with apartheid in Canada and the US, which is what created the residential school systems, and the genocide of Indigenous people in our two countries is what inspired South Africa. And then the saying goes, and then it was sort of perfected in Palestine in terms of the way that Israel has approached the settler colonial project there. So I sort of see at a meta level these narratives. It's really about a very specific savior meme narrative, which is interesting because that's actually the title of the chapter that talks about true cost in the book. And I've been reflecting on that a lot as it's been talked about in all of these online chats that I've been participating in the last 8 months as this conversation has happened. And one of the things is I think there's been this deep philosophical connection, which was there all along, that is about the conflating capitalism. And what we mean by capitalism really is colonial corporate capitalism with democracy. So just like I think Zionism has conflated, tried to conflate themselves with Judaism on the large, we have so-called Western values of democracy being essentially in the service of only this colonial corporate capitalist worldview. And I think that's kind of something that Adbusters has been pushing against all along. It's something that the book kind of doesn't take on in that specific way, but certainly this idea of true cost and the idea of the true cost is essentially pointing out the externalities, going back to the corporation film. But the externalities are what the corporate entities try to diminish as being real, but those are what are the actual costs. And right now, the externality of our sort of notion of democracy is that we have to assimilate into this colonial corporate capitalist structure, which it's inherently deeply violent. So I think the narrative that's going on with that, you see it play out in the very violent attacks that have happened. I'm in British Columbia, as is I think you are too, Gord. But the very violent attacks on the land defenders in some of the areas in Wet'suwet'en and other places where literally there's been a militarization of special police forces to violently take down these encampments to try to prevent the pipeline that actually has now gone through, which is a terrible, terrible thing. So what enables that, I guess, the narratives that enable that are when sort of nice, well-meaning people who don't want to be divisive want their movements to be really sanitized. And I think at the moment, because of what people are seeing on their screens about what's happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank, that's been exploded a little bit in terms of, they're not seeing it in the mainstream media, but all of the students that are part of these student movements, they're seeing it 24/7 on their phones when they're looking. So that's what's changed. And I've been thinking a lot about this since the book came out. I think it was back in August when the book first came out. And I was getting nostalgic about, the activism of my youth 30 years ago. And then when this whole escalation, because it certainly didn't start on October 7th, but when that escalation happened, it kind of took over our minds at Adbusters as well, because we've been talking about that issue amongst all of them all along. But the interconnectedness of us all became very, very, very clear, because it's a matter of, like you said, Daniel, this these amount of money going in to prevent alternative candidates. Basically, I haven't had much of a view of democracy, but the way that I was articulating that lately is the illusion I had of democracy has been betrayed. The idea, like even the idea of it. And I think that's happening to politicizing a whole generation at the moment. And I hope that makes a difference. So I think in terms of making a difference, I think showing solidarity does make a difference. And not everyone is going to join the resistance in the same way, but I think we shouldn't be afraid to say we should join the resistance. Like, the resistance is what we need to be doing on all of these levels, because the same people that are cracking down on pipelines are cracking down on people who resist. Like, that is what has been happening. So that's what I thought about that. In terms of sort of grassroots and where things could go, I do think that there's been a real change in how people view what they're seeing from the media, because of the sort of betrayal of the mainstream media that's become so obvious to anyone who's looking at alternative media right now. So I think that's an opening. And to put it in kind of blunt, specific terms, organic reach has been throttled on social media by the business model of selling ads, right? That we've known that for a while. Now we have the additional thing of outright and very deep censorship going on all the platforms. And yet, that's the media is like the actual narrative is shifting from the point of view of the grassroots. Like, the grassroots are shifting the narrative in spite of it all. So I think that's a good sign in terms of the potential to keep doing what is happening, which is engaging in these discussions around what has to change. And the fact that they're being identified, and this isn't new either, the intersectionality of the crises that we're facing, all of them, and the kind of what has been demonstrated so brutally by assimilation versus, like hanging on to culture in every way. That's what's at stake right now, I think, across the world, like in our very local spaces and in these larger global spaces. And the thing is, I was reflecting a little bit on 1999 with the WTO. And like one of you said, was it William? I can't remember. The whole when capitalism went global, in the globalization of all of this in the 80s, sort of resulted in this the rise of accessibility through the internet to self-publishing and all of these platforms. And so I think the apex of that was the preparation for the WTO protests. And all of the organizing, all of the kind of teach-ins that were happening, all of the affinity groups that were going on, all of that really, it worked at the moment. It shut down the WTO for a while. It actually shut it down. But as I observed in the middle of all that, it's the first time I saw protests so well documented. Like this is the indie media offices in Seattle and all of these things. Everything was being documented. Everything was being shared. Everyone was organizing. And then the surveillance, the crackdown came hard and heavy. And now we are at a crisis point. We're at a crisis point with the climate. We're at the crisis point with this concept of like whether we even have democratic examples anywhere in the world. And we have a crisis around the absolute violence that we're seeing in the service of keeping the people in power. And so has this surveillance increased. But it really is, and this was one of the things that I remember reading in one of my first issues of Adbusters 30 years ago, which was the quote, World War III will be a guerrilla information war with no division between the civilian and military participants. Good old Marshall McLuhan wrote that in the 60s. And I think that combined with just the tools of surveillance that we have with us, it's like we have the power to interfere with that, but we also have to be aware of how much force there is out there. So I think the only solution is revolution. Well, but solidarity in that, like finding solidarity is not necessarily joining the same fight in every moment, but really creating that sort of solidarity that I think is happening with the protests around Gaza right now. I have not seen this level of activity and solidarity and devotion to learning about what's going on and the application of it to all these other struggles. Like these are the conversations that I'm observing in these teaching groups that I'm not directly participating in, but I've kind of been in touch with some of the people doing these things. And the level of discourse around connecting these things, like I said, I think that's going to be a shape-shifting thing. Will it be enough to change things politically in the short term? I don't know, because things are not looking good right now. But I think that we have the tools, and I think the manifesto isn't so much a prescriptive book, but more of an inspiration to take up these tools. Like I think the one thing I've always thought is if we don't take up these tools for these kind of revolutionary purposes, we are at the best of times just inundated with pure capitalist marketing, and at the worst of times we're silenced, surveilled, and shut down. So fighting back is necessary.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, I like to think of the manifesto as like it's the excuse to talk about, it's the permission to talk about this for those who need permission to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Daniel wanted to jump in and say something before we move on.
Yeah. I just had a quick comment around narrative. And I think part of the successful narrative of capitalism is the reason that some people think that the current protests in Gaza are student protests. Every protest that I've been to has been multi-generational. There have been alumni of the school. There have been protesters, professors, sorry, get arrested with them. This is something that we've seen on a regular basis at all major universities. Definitely been here at UCLA. It's been at Harvard. It's been around the country. But that narrative is diminished. And I've been shadow banned on Instagram since like October, but somehow people still find my stuff, and I've literally reposted stuff that other people post, and it's been flagged and taken down because it's supposedly showing violence when it's actually showing the result of violence.
Yeah.
But the last thing that I wanted to say, and I think the thing that we should emphasize a little bit, is that at least since the COVID pandemic and many communities, hundreds of years before, there has been this outgrowth of mutual aid. Communities that didn't know what mutual aid was, I'd never read Kropotkin, I'd never pronounced his name correctly, but the mutual aid networks are something that I believe Democracy Unlimited and Move to Amend are very interested in tapping into, because to some degree they're the only way that people have survived, and they are the incubation of real resistance.
Yeah, and on that note, what we're trying to do with Cool World, I would sort of see as akin to trying to create some digital tools that are akin to mutual aid. So we're able to not use those corporate platforms, but not have to use them as the only way to get our news out and our information out. And the way that becomes is by what we're working on now. Like what people signed up to get to this event today was just pretty much an event page. But what we're hoping to build is an app that works a little bit to be a replacement for Eventbrite, that's also been censoring things and really going the capitalist route now with monetizing their platform. But what we'd like to create is a network where we're able to offer tools to people that are similar to these other tools that are out there, but that can be shared individually and through the network to gain that narrative power. So building narrative solidarity is like the way that I like to put it. That isn't beholden to Meta or Alphabet or Twitter or X or whatever it is these days. And they can't be censored because you're actually connected to people without relying only on them, even though we're not bypassing them and can also share it on those platforms. But the app would allow you to be, the content to be self-contained and be able to be promoted and used any way that people need to, and that's where the mutual aid comes in, with the opportunity for campaigners, content creators, people who are creating the event to help monetize it for whatever purpose they want, whether it's to support their creative work or whether it's to support the particular cause that it's about. So that's one of the things that right now we're finding, that people are very interested in giving to projects when they don't have a barrier. That's one of the reasons we keep making our events free or pay what you can. But once we do that, we find that people are willing to give to people. And that has been a kind of creative mutual aid or a grassroots activist mutual aid network of sorts. It's very small at the moment, but I could see how that could build out to something very useful to people, because even the big platforms like GoFundMe and all these things, they take a pretty big cut.
You're on mute, Greg.
Yeah, we have two more topics we wanted to address, so please bear with us. And the next one, we've already actually touched on this, so maybe we don't have to do quite as much of a deep dive, since it addresses the topic of culture and the role of culture in creating change. Culture can both oppress and liberate. What success people's movements have had in the US and elsewhere have always been due in part to individuals overcoming the dominant culture of their place, which has consisted of resignation, fear, limited possibilities, self-doubt, alienation, personal material acquisition, and the narrative that progress is continual, everything is fine, mass resistance is counterproductive. So those have been all the things that have been pounded into our brains. But culture can also liberate in an integral component of creating change. So back to you, Kat, very briefly. How has, you've been so involved in Adbusters, which of course has been a major theme of them is cultural change. And so why is culture change so important, and how has it been embedded as inextricably so in the strategies and the tactics that you've been connected with in so many years in creating system change?
Well, I think it goes back to, again, shifting that internal narrative in people. Nobody ever changes what they do because you convince them of a bunch of facts. They have some sort of moment that transforms them from feeling like they can go along with a status quo that softens its image with, entertainment and the so-called veneer of civilization, but is deeply at its core very violent. So I'm seeing that, like, one of the things that I think Adbusters does and that the corporation did is it cracked open a little window for some people, quite a few people, I hope, to think differently about business as usual in all of the senses of that word. And I think that what's happening at the moment right now, like I said, with all of these, what people are able to see live in real time on their phone, like that phrase that keeps coming up, This is the first time there's been a genocide streamed live 24/7. This is a horrible fact, but it's also, and I don't want to qualify it as, the bright side of it, because that's not what I mean by that, but it is having that transformational effect on people. And I say that because I've been observing people who were not activists, people who were not outspoken, people who were not feeling like there was a lot wrong with the world, having those moments of total conversion. And I think that is the difference. So like you're quite right. I've been in a lot of protests, and they have been multi-generational, all of them. And I think even the encampments, I don't know, I can't speak for all of them, but some of the ones close to home here, I know there's been a whole lot of solidarity with other groups. There's been a lot of community support for those students, but there's been something, at least one thing a week going on every single day since October, every single week, if not several times a week, of some kind. And if people want to find them, they find them. So I think that's what's different, that all the shadow banning and money in the world can't stop someone who has had a moment where they feel it and they can't go back. You can't, like, I keep hearing this as well from people, that everything has changed. You can never go back from this. And that is the moment that I think people at different times, if they're activists, have had at different moments in their life. But for people who haven't had it, that's the moment, like wherever their red line is crossed. And I really love what William and Adbusters did the other day with the red line. The day after the apocalypse in Rafah, and they were trying to figure out what to put as a meme. And he did this red line, like Biden's red line, and he went like, that's the red line. That's where we're at. Just this. And I found that quite profound, actually. So those moments are what we need to do, but what we need to work at creating. But they can't be like, they aren't prescriptive. They plant those seeds, and that's where the organizing comes in afterwards. The organizing has to give people a place to take that and to take it into where it can have some sort of more structural change. But I do think changing that idea about, like, if we could actually take a whole society and say that assimilation isn't the goal in life to capitalism and to the powers that be, that would be a start.
Yeah, indeed. Jenny, what about you? What's the role of culture in the movement to abolish corporate constitutional rights, as well as, this doctrine that money spent in elections is free speech?
We live in a corporate culture, right? So I think that a culture that's dominated through corporate media, it is the biggest democracy that money could buy. Culture shift is vital, and we recognize that in the work that we're doing to end corporate rule. I do want to say that I was inspired by the books delve into culture jamming and visuals and meme wars. I was also inspired by Gord. I watched a video that you did recently about art and street art and that kind of stuff. And then right after that, I went to New Orleans to visit family, and I had my camera out, I'm like, it's everywhere, and, the work we've been doing for the past 10 years, we know we are starting to strike, and, it's high time, right? We're in an ecological crisis, not just a democracy crisis. And so the idea of culture and, how will we get where we want to be? What will the new society look like? How do we reverse the climate crisis and restore our relationship with the earth? These are all, always forefront in Move to Amend's organizing. What does that global cooperation look like without U.S. imperialism? So these are always pressing issues that we're working on, and I want to mention too that Adbusters has been a powerful influence on the visuals for Move to Amend since pretty much since our inception. The corporate flag for us was more legitimate symbol of the current state of our nation than the one hanging upside down, at half mast outside of a Supreme Court justice's house, right? And I think that's really important to go back to that and to think about that in our cultural jamming, as a cultural jammer. We do need to change the culture to change the world. And so our core belief at Move to Amend is that inalienable rights and rights to self-expression and governance, both individually and through our local communities, should be the law of the land. And that means that we have the rights to make decisions for what's our own common good. So it's tantamount, right? And it's really important. And if you can, look up culture, U.S. culture, you're going to get dings on corporate culture. It is the dominant culture, and it is oppressive. But I think a decentralized yet organized and in allyship with each other is really important for the work that we're doing. And I think that I was also struck by, in the book, when they were talking about working with designers, the first things and the first manifesto for 2000, they were looking to work together to create a mojo that stirs people's souls, right? And disrupts their toxic routines. And it tips the whole human project towards justice. I love that quote. And there's tons of them in this book. So if you haven't had a chance to jump into it, I highly suggest it. But, it's time to summon the tricksters out of the shadows.
Indeed. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, we want to, at this point, I think, move to questions, Q&A. Those we've sort of seen in the chat some of the questions that you who are participating and listening in and watching have offered. So, Jason, I don't know if you've noticed any. I'll start with one pretty early on that Alfonso, and thanks, Alfonso, for posting. Apparently, there have been several questions related to this Heritage Foundation Project 2025. I don't know if any of the panelists are aware of this and care to comment about what that is and the threat it poses to people, communities, the planet, whatever amount of democracy, self-governance we have or have ever had. Anyone want to take that on?
I'll comment second.
Who wants to comment first? Go ahead, Daniel.
So a lot of Project 2025 is really what a lot of the most ultra conservatives have been saying out loud for over 40 years. It is not actually new. And the unfortunate thing that people do not want to hear, especially in this current moment where there is a genocide unfolding that's fully supported by the United States government in Palestine, is that a lot of the things that people are afraid of that will happen under Project 2025 are happening. And that is something that I think many people on this panel will have comments about. We need to speak realistically and not stop thinking about. I pushed back on a little of the book when it talked about lefties not being this or that. I don't completely agree with that. I agree with some points, but that was the part of the book that I was like, I don't know. But the part that really talks about, the Democratic and Republican Party and some of their shared fascist tendencies and or policies, the fact that there are kids in cages, the fact that there is, continued mass surveillance, and there is like an immigration deal that Biden is pushing that is basically Trump's deal. The fact that we're on the surface talking about like humanitarian crises and sending $14 billion to Israel again, that is something that we need to deal with for real. It is not just this boogeyman of the Republican Party. It is culture. It is our American culture being mutated to such a degree that as long as we are on the winning team, we will not call out the atrocities to indigenous people. Still very much to Black people. Nothing has changed since the uprisings around George Floyd and other unarmed killings of Black people, indigenous people, Latino people, poor white people around this country. If we're going to have a discussion about 2025, it needs to be an honest discussion and not a discussion just about the faults of our opponent, but our own faults. And that is what I would like to contribute to this response.
Jason, you see any question you wanted to lift up?
I think we can go with what's on the screen there. I was like, how do we address the fears around Project 2025? And it went away, so I don't have the rest of it.
Yeah.
But I think the reason this question I think is good is like, we hear so often, and multiple levels of awareness that folks and communities are paralyzed in the face of the oppression and repression that is happening. Even in the face of the mass uprisings that are happening with the students and stuff, there's still, a fear that is the undercurrent of many communities. So I would like to hear from the panels is like, how would you address that? What would you say? How do we address the fear and come out better on the other side? Go ahead, William.
So I want to maybe just string up a few thoughts in relation to that question and discussion of Project 2025. So it's a very scary project, 2025. And I think Danielle is absolutely right. It's being put forward by the Republican side, but it's a project that comes out of the ruling class, across the board, that their political representatives in both parties in the state. And moreover, it's the US version of this larger fascist response worldwide to this crisis. But what I also want to say is that response is in part it's a response to our resistance from below that we've been speaking about throughout this this session. We've always had these flashpoints, so we never stop struggling from below. But we've had periodic flashpoints that capture U.S. and worldwide attention. So if we take it from 2008, from the global financial collapse that launched us into this massive crisis, we had Occupy Wall Street in 2011, violently repressed. Then we had Ferguson as the big flashpoint, violently repressed. Then we had Standing Rock, 2016 into 2016, violently repressed. We had the BLM uprising, 2020, and now we have the global intifada of solidarity with Palestine. All of this, of course, violently repressed. That we know and that we've been discussing. But for me, this program 2025 has several objectives. One is to further liberate capital from any accountability and any constraint, whether it's in the United States or worldwide, but also to really consolidate this violent repression and control from above in a more organized fascist project. And yes, it's very scary. But two things in response to that. People are going to be paralyzed by fear. That we want to say that fascism has to have a social base. Okay, the ruling class can't rule without some mass social base. And so we have to ask the question and be honest with ourselves. On the left, I consider myself on the left. I agree actually with Danielle that, we can't stop talking about left and right completely. But what I want to say here is that this mass mobilization for fascism, it has a mass social base. And that mass social base is in major sectors of the working class in the United States that have been socioeconomically destabilized, that have been turned into precarious labor, structurally unemployed, and a big significant section of that working class, which is downwardly mobile, is not hearing a less message from the left. It's not hearing a message, this is your problem, it's the system itself and we're standing by you. Instead, it's getting the message from the fascists. And that's, in part, is on us. And part of it is also, and I know this is going to be hard-hitting for some people to hear, but part of it, only a part of the story, but we need to focus on it, is this notion that these white, poor white working people, what Hillary Clinton called the baskets. I forgot what the word she used.
Deplorable.
The deplorables. Those are poor white people that have been, maybe at one time they did have privilege, but now they're totally destabilized. And if we don't get to them, organizing them with a message of multiracial, multicultural, solidarity and struggle, then they're going to be mobilized by fascists. And then there's a mass social base for this project 2025.
I saw a question about what's the role of direct action. I think John Howe. Here we go. What will be the role of direct action that seeks to disrupt the function of the existing system? We had a whole section about social change and community grassroots organizing. So this ties into that. Anyone?
Go ahead, Gord. He's on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think direct actions are really a critical part of any kind of radical movement. One thing I like to compare is, we've heard mention of Standing Rock. So Standing Rock was this huge mobilization, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people went there. They raised millions of dollars. There were celebrities talking about that campaign, and they failed and they were defeated. And I compare that to another struggle I don't know if people have heard about. It was in Elsie Pugtug, which was a Mi'kmaq community in New Brunswick. And they, just a couple years before Standing Rock, they were faced with exploratory drilling for shale rock fracking. This company was coming in to do this exploratory work to locate shale gas deposits. So the community, Elsie Pugtug, they used a diversity of tactics. They started out with a typical civil disobedience, protests, blocking their highway. The police came in and arrested them. Then a more militant approach was taken, and they started erecting more stronger blockades and sabotaging these seismic devices that the company was using. They blockaded their vehicles in their parking compounds so that they couldn't even leave to go and do this exploratory work. And so it's very successful. And it manifested a huge police mobilization that came in. There was conflicts with the people. In one confrontation, the police retreated and abandoned 6 of their police cars, which were then set on fire. So this was a huge confrontation, a huge conflict that was occurring here in Canada. And the end result of it was that this company withdrew and failed to carry out their objective, which was to do all this seismic testing to locate shale rock gas deposits. The next year, there was a provincial election, which was basically seen as a moratorium on fracking. Are we going to go with fracking or are we not? And the political party that was opposed to fracking won. So to me, that it shows that direct action is a very important part of any campaign. And I contrast that with Standing Rock, where you had thousands and thousands of people, and they weren't able to achieve their objective, which was to stop the pipeline. So that's a really it's crucial to our movements to use direct action and to disrupt the system, and not just to do peaceful protest and have petitions and to petition the government. The real power is with the people, and that manifests itself with direct action.
Sorry. Jenny, you go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more on that, Gord. And Standing Rock was successful in bringing those people together and empowering community, both there at Standing Rock and those who joined an allyship. And it has, I think that has spurred where we are now with the end fossil fuels actions, so it's like we're done with that totally. We're not going to fight although we still need to fight those fires, those one pipelines and one fracking exploration at a time, but more broadly, that we need to end the legacy of the oil industrial complex and its stranglehold it's had over our country. I felt really desperate after the BP oil spill, but I have been nothing but inspired since Standing Rock. So I think that that's really important, that we are still building on that. And so are organizing like the Project 2025, right? And we also have Cop City going on right now in resistance to that in Atlanta, and trying to save the Weelaunee forests, and the violence, the organized violence from officers in that area. So, it is a back and forth, but we are at a point where, we have to win if we are going to get to a point that we are living in a sustaining biosystem. So I can't agree with your points more, Gordon.
Yep. Any others before we sort of try to begin wrapping this up?
I just wanted to make a quick point about fear. All of the social movements that have had any type of profound impact on the United States in the course of and the existence of marginalized people have had to deal with that. I feel like we are unfortunate that we are at the point where more and more, and I feel like Kat and other people have spoken about this in the terms of intersectionality, where our futures are intertwined more and more, and we see that more and more, and it's not something that we have to explain to people. When people were getting shot in Mississippi and Alabama for registering people to vote, that was a Black thing. When the Trail of Tears happened, that was an Indigenous people's thing. When women were literally getting beat up for advocating for the right to vote, that was a very gendered female thing. At the current moment, we are all suffering from the collective impacts of late stage capitalism, whether that is in terms of foreign policy and war or extreme income inequality. The Dow Jones has no fucking effect on whether or not me and most of my friends are doing well. And I think that's something that can potentially, if we move from just information and allowing, people to know what's happening, to here's the information, here's what we're going to do first, and here are a couple of other steps that we're going to do, but we're not going to share too much about because infiltrators happens all the time. If we can just move from information to action, and I just wanted to really quickly address one person's comment, and I might not need a final comment because I've been talking for a while. There is an impact that elected officials can have if they both run a campaign and serve a term that actually serves the people. If they get into a situation where they're completely focused on their own reelection, and they convince you that their reelection and their elevated status is in your best interest, while they continue to not do anything to increase, your interest or your viability as a human or your economic interest, that doesn't matter. But there are transformative people who move the conversation forward. What we need to realize that moving the conversation forward is not enough. We need action. MLK challenged JFK. MLK challenged presidents, and he left without agreement, saying this is not enough. We need more. We need that type of action now with Biden and Gaza, but for any type of president, Congress member, state representative, or local representative to say you're not doing enough. And we need to convince the people who are there in solidarity with us that our objection that this is not enough is not working against their aims. It's working for them because we all deserve more.
Indeed.
Hmm.
Well, there's a lot more that could be said. Many questions that have been offered that, unfortunately, due to time, we can't answer at the moment. But this is not the end. This is merely sort of the beginning of an ongoing, we hope, collective conversation. And Jason is going to sort of talk about where do we go from here, but just, very, very, very briefly, just sort of the key points that I heard, trying to quantify them and organize them in a way, is 4 points. One is, we need to call out those who are a part in causing the harms and injustices, whether it's corporate entities, whether it's the economic system, whether it's the cultural domination, whether it's the politicians, political parties, transnationals, whatever. They need to be called out very clearly, very directly. We have to resist those harms. Resist, we have to put out fires, but we also have to ask who are the arsonists by focusing on coming together and having social movements that include direct action, that are authentically inclusive, that are interconnected, but at the same time that we're trying to form social movements. Part of that social movement formation is to create parallel structures and alternatives, and some of which were mentioned in the comments. So those are the 4 takeaways for me that tried to capture some of the very insightful wisdom of our panelists. Jason, you want to sort of take it away in terms of where do we go from here?
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, the panelists and the audience, for sticking with us tonight in this conversation. And I want to invite everybody to just take a moment and see each individual on this screen. And just take in for a moment. I know we've talked a lot and it's been an hour and a half, but just taking a moment of what everybody brought to this space and absorb what they said. And know these individuals are representation of a larger movement. Everything that we said in this space tonight is something that we're all collectively working together towards, a world that we all deserve. And I want to invite each and every one of you who is watching this, either live or the recorded, to stay in contact with everybody you see, whether it's the organizations, Radical God, Move to Amend, Cool World, Adbusters, whether it's Gord, whether it's Williams. Connect and see what they're up to, see what they're putting out in the world, and see where you can contribute as well. Cool World, after this call, soon after this call, we'll send out an email to all those who registered with all the links to the books, to the websites, to the things that we covered, to the individuals on this call, so you can connect with these folks and connect with these movements and connect with these conversations even more after this. But this conversation doesn't end when we finish this call. This conversation is just a beginning for us to be in conversation together, to organize together. You'll see in the links that the email go out, there's things coming up that we're all working on and that we invite you to. So please sign up for the newsletters. There's events coming up in June that we want you to be at. Reach out to us personally and say, hey, I have an idea. Can we collaborate? It's all welcome because we're in this together. And I hope everything that you heard tonight reinforces that. And again, deep, deep gratitude for everyone on this panel, for the organizations that helped bring this together, and for the time that everyone that was a participant or on the panel gave tonight for this conversation. We can do this, and we will do this. So thank you, and y'all have a great evening, great morning, wherever you're at.
Thank you all.
Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. read the Constitution, there seems to be some type of confusion. I thought it said the people were the institution and not the corporations that simply want to use them. The truth is currently a fusion of corporate loot and our government that is outright abusive. People need change. The state, it refuses. They're saying we're mistaken. Well, show us where the proof is. They control the media, movies, and the music, and determine where supplies of the water and food live. We need a strategy. Here is a solution. Build a movement to give our rulers improvements. An infusion of human to counteract the hubris that has our ecosystem near useless and our youth pissed. The founding fathers were flawed, but they knew this.